Welcome back to Art Appreciation, everybody. So today is our first lecture, and today we'll be speaking about the nature and purpose of art. So if we jump right on in. So what I find interesting about art is the ability to create is one of the special characteristics of humanity. If we think about humanity's evolution, especially in ancient times, we don't really have the same capabilities as other animal species on this planet. If we think about, what does a lion have to defend itself with? It has, sharp claws and big teeth and everything like that. But comparatively speaking, what do we as humans have? Well, it's arguably this ability to think and to create things that are new, that don't necessarily exist in nature. So, creativity and this ability to bring forth new things is arguably what makes us human, especially within the realm of the natural world. And so it's definitely a major driving force in human history and human evolution and culture and all kinds of things like that. So art is very much important and very central and core to our being as human beings in general. And so I like to show this image. This is a depiction of woolly rhinoceros from Chauvet Cave in southern France. And these drawings date to between 28 and 37,000 years BCE, or before Common Era. So this is, one example of many that really highlights just how old artwork is. It's something that's a very ubiquitous experience in the human experience in general, and it's always been with us. In fact, it probably dates much, much, much further back than we even have examples of that survive to this day. So it's really a very important aspect of us as a species on the whole. Now, what I find interesting though is that we don't necessarily have to understand art to enjoy it. We can actually enjoy art simply for its aesthetically pleasing qualities. However, if we do know something about art, a little bit of background about it, it can help inform our opinions of it. And so it can offer us greater insight into the artist's own mind. It can also add insight into historical time periods and all kinds of things like that. So throughout the course of this class, we'll be looking at not only some of the reasons for making art, some of the ways artists have gone about making art, but we'll also look at some of the historical context behind certain works of art, especially when we start to talk about different artistic periods. And so a lot of that kind of context informs how we view the work of art, what we know about it, what aspects of it can we recognize, its symbolic motifs, all kinds of things like that. So understanding a little bit about art just in general improves our experience of the artwork as a whole. And so over the course of this semester, I hope to impart at least some of those kinds of characteristics on you guys, so that if you see artwork in your regular lives after this, you can at least come to it with a little bit more information and everything like that. Now, artistic creation is a two-way street. So we create art, and then art creates enrichment in our lives. And so some ways that this might happen would be through things like teaching. Artwork has definitely been used as a teaching tool for many, many centuries, specifically in the realm of religion. In the days before most people were literate, artwork allowed common people to see religious stories that they might not be able to read from religious texts, things like that. And so in that light, it can also be used to touch the spirit. A lot of religious artwork in general, no matter what religion we're talking about, is meant to uplift our spiritual experience through the recognition of aesthetic beauty within the work of art, things like that. So think about like stained glass in a cathedral. It reflects all this colored light into the space and makes this kind of very ornate atmosphere within the building or the structure itself. So once again, a lot of art is used to enhance our spiritual experience. Now, it can also be used to communicate history. So, for many centuries as well, one of the major kind of subjects of painting in particular was history painting. And so, this, communicated not only mythological subject matter, but religious subject matter, actual historical subjects, all kinds of things like that. Also, looking at artworks from the past that are, not necessarily history paintings, but depicting contemporary life for when they were created, it can give us insight into those historical periods. So, it can show us how people dressed at the time or how they were thinking about certain ideas or information, all kinds of things like this. But it can also be used to inspire us or to challenge us to see things in new ways. And so a lot of artwork, especially starting with about the 19th century coming forward into the contemporary world, really tries to challenge us to see and interpret information in new and different ways that we might not otherwise be willing to experience or deal with or anything like that. So art can really do a number of things for us. Now, we might ask ourselves, what is art? And this is a very subjective kind of thing, especially nowadays. And depending on when we're talking about in history, this definition might change quite radically. But there are some major, things that we can discuss as art forms. And so these would be things like traditional fine art, which incorporates things like painting and sculpture and architecture, things like that. This is primarily what we'll be dealing with for this for our class. But we can also consider things like music and dance to be art forms. We can even think about things like theater, film, and photography, as well as literature, to all be different kinds of art forms. And so, interestingly, each art form is perceived in different ways, yet they all fulfill a common need for expressive substance. So, all of these different forms are different ways of expressing ourselves, but they're all going to be read in different ways. So obviously, reading a book is going to be a much different experience than, say, looking at an illustration from a book in a painting or something like that. So depending on what kind of art we're looking at, our experience of it is always going to be dramatically different. And so this is something that many artists will play up or downplay or kind of mix mash. And I also find it interesting that many of these art forms can also be intermingled together. So if we think about things like film, film usually incorporates not only photography and theater, but music and dance and all kinds of different things. It's a very multimedia kind of art form. So once again, it's really hard to define what art is specifically, especially nowadays where basically anything can be art so long as we can make a justification for it. Now, what I find interesting though is that art can convey things beyond ordinary or verbal kinds of exchanges. So, for instance, art can make clear certain ambiguities within language or other things like that. And one way that art can do this is through something like an allegory. And an allegory is the representation of very complex or abstract ideas in very simple or straightforward kinds of manners. And so here we can see this is Peter Paul Rubens' Allegory to the Consequences of War. Now, we could arguably fill entire libraries with books on nothing but the subject of warfare. And so how do you distill all of that information into one single image? Well, there's where allegory comes in. And so if we look at it, we can see many different attributes of this one kind of, over-encompassing, subject. So we can see, a soldier here in the center. He's clad in armor. He's going into battle. His, wife is over here trying to kind of, keep him from doing this. So she's showing lament. We can see, this other kind of lamenting figure over here. We can also see this very chaotic kind of background, death, terror, and fear, all of these kinds of things. But once again, we can make individual paintings based on each individual aspect within this. However, combining them all together creates an allegory for us. Similarly, this is just one example. We might also be able to create allegory off of abstract things like emotion. So, for instance, how do you represent love? Once again, what I experience as love might be completely different from what you guys experience as love. So, there's a lot of subjectivity that goes on there. And so, this is one thing that I find interesting about art is that we can use it to, make concrete these ambiguities depending on our own subjective experience and things like that. Now, aside from that, there are certain things that are really only perceptible through visual kinds of means. Here we have a nice example of this. This is what's known as grain stacks in sunlight, morning effect by Claude Monet. And Claude Monet is perhaps the most well-known impressionist. He's definitely one of the founders of the impressionistic movement, but he's very interested, along with many of the other impressionists, in representing changes in atmosphere and lighting, and very much interested in how the human eye actually physically perceives things like color and light and the changes of these things. And so Claude Monet would go and he did hundreds of paintings, sometimes of the same subject. This particular subject he painted at least a few hundred times. But every time he would paint it in different atmospheric conditions. So different times of day, different times of year, different weather, all kinds of things like that. And each time it would be subtly different. But he's looking at how light plays on our perception of a subject. And so this is something that can really only be perceived through visual means. I mean, how would you describe a sunrise or a sunset to a blind person who has no frame of reference for such things? It would be almost impossible. So certain things are really only perceptible through visual kinds of means. But here we can just see, another example of that to illustrate the point, in that we have the exact same subject by Claude Monet, so wheat or grain stacks, once again. However, this time, as opposed to being presented to us in perhaps early morning or midday kind of situation, now we have it presented to us at that kind of twilight dusk time frame. And so it gives an overall different reading to the subject itself. And so once again, this is something that can be made perceptible through visual means such as painting here. Now, a couple definitions just for our purposes. So a work of art for our purposes, even though art can be defined as many different things, generally speaking, is a visual expression of an idea or an experience through a medium. So whenever we take a visual experience or an idea and we interpret it through a medium, we have created a work of art. Now, a medium refers to a particular material along with its accompanying technique, with media being the plural. So, some examples of mediums or media would be things like paint, charcoal, wood, stone, earth, or collage, and everything like that. And so, a medium is often chosen to suit the function of a work of art as well. And I think this is an important thing to note because, once again, our perception of a painting hanging on a wall is going to be much different than our perception of a, monumental size sculpture that's done in marble or bronze or something like that. So we're going to perceive each of those works of art in different ways. And so, once again, oftentimes an artist will choose a medium based on the visual impact they want their artwork to have. Now, in addition to media, we also have what's referred to as mixed media. And this is a combination of mediums in a given work of art. So there are a variety of ways that we can go about doing this. This is definitely much more common nowadays in the contemporary world, but it definitely goes way, way back into history as well. But we have traditional, kind of combinations of dry and wet media, so things like drawing and painting going hand in hand. In the realm of 3D or sculpture, there's what's known as assemblage. So we're actually bringing together all kinds of different materials to create a sculpture out of. So maybe wood or clay or paint, stone, all kinds of different stuff. But we could even think of things like film as being multimedia artworks, because once again, film incorporates not only photography but performance, music, all kinds of things like this. Excuse me. So it's a very, very interesting kind of phenomenon. But a nice example of a mixed media artwork, here we have Mark Bradford's Bread and Circus. If you choose to do one of our, extra credits by doing a museum tour online, the Modern Art Museum in Fort Worth is actually showcasing Mark Bradford's work right now. But these are massive multimedia collages that are made with non-traditional materials. So I think his work is rather interesting because these are massive in scale. Each of his pieces are like 30 by 50 feet at least. They're huge in scale. But he's also using non-traditional materials. So he's using, in this instance, in Bread and Circus here, he's using tin foil. He's also using oil paint and charcoal and other drawing materials and things like this. So I've always found that kind of interesting. But he also creates these almost like sculpture in that he layers all this material up. And it's not just traditional materials. He's also collaging, paper material and other things like that. And then he goes and carves back out of it. And so it creates this kind of undulating effect on the surface. But he's also usually referencing things about contemporary society. Mark Bradford is an African American artist, and a lot of his work deals with the kind of ebb and flow of urban culture and contemporary urban environments and things like that. This particular one, he's harkening back to this idea of ancient Rome, in which bread and circus was used to distract the public from political intrigue and things like that. So definitely something we should all be somewhat familiar with in our contemporary world as well. But not all artists are dealing with multimedia artwork in the same way. Here we have just another example, which you can also see at the Fort Worth Modern. This is Anselm Kiefer's Ash Flower. And what I find interesting about Anselm Kiefer is that he's using very non-traditional painting materials. So he's using tar, he's using mud. In fact, if you look at the bottom of this, if you were there in person, there's actually caked on mud that sticks off the frame, about a good foot. He's also incorporated the use of this very tall dried sunflower stalk in this as well. And it's important to note that this painting is also massive in scale. It's once again at like 30 by 50 feet. It's very, very large. But his work is dealing much more with the adverse effects of history and things like that. Anselm Kiefer is German by birth, and a lot of his artwork deals with what it means to be a German in the post-World War II atmosphere. We should all be familiar with what takes place during that time period. But that's a little beside the point. But once again, he's using very non-traditional kinds of materials within his multimedia artwork. So I've always found that to be kind of interesting. Now, we might also ask ourselves, what is creativity? And so this is, once again, a very subjective kind of question. And creativity in general is a very subjective phenomenon because, once again, we're all going to experience it in different ways. We're going to come to it from different backgrounds, all kinds of things like that. But creativity, once again, one of these things that arguably makes us human and what makes humans who we are, because very few other animals in the animal kingdom can really demonstrate creativity in the same way. And once again, even if they are able to, it's in a much more limited capacity than we are able to. And so this is pretty much a uniquely human kind of experience. But generally speaking, once again, creativity is the ability to bring forth something new which has value over novelty. And so once again, this is very subjective because what I, deem to be valuable might be completely different than what you guys might find valuable. And the same thing with novelty. What I find novel, you guys might find mundane or something like that. But some general traits of creativity that we can talk about are things like association or the ability to form connections. So, can we form connections between disparate sources of information to bring forth something new, or to create, parallels or conjectures that make us think about things in new and different ways? Questioning or the challenging of the status quo. So we'll see, especially when we get into our discussion of art history, how many artists, especially starting in the 19th century, begin to challenge the prevailing notions of what art was up to that point, and they begin to do radically different things with their art. And so they're challenging and questioning, what they're seeing and what they've been told. Now, observation is another trait of creativity, and this is watching without judgment in search of insight. So, many times, to really truly observe, we have to put our own prejudices aside and interact with things in a fresh way, even though they might be uncomfortable for us, or they might be, completely against our worldview. Sometimes we have to set our own personal qualms aside and deal with things from a fresh perspective. And so, but this can lead us to new and greater things sometimes. So, once again, this is also a very subjective kind of statement. But aside from that, we also have networking, or the willingness to interact with others. And this is definitely a major aspect of artwork, especially in the contemporary world. But even going further back, there's always been artistic collaborations, the ability to look at what someone else is doing and, perhaps not necessarily copy them, but, kind of bring their innovations into our own sphere. Nowadays, with the internet, we have all kinds of possibilities in that regard. And that, we can get on Instagram and see what an artist is doing in China or in Germany or in Brazil or, whoever, wherever, So it's an interesting kind of phenomenon now. But experimentation is also a major aspect of creativity. And it kind of goes hand in hand with this idea of questioning, because experimentation is the exploration of new possibilities. And so, many artists are constantly trying to explore what they're able to do with their medium or with their artwork, their subject matter, et cetera, et cetera. And this is definitely something that I, as an artist myself, am constantly doing. If you looked at my paintings from 10 or 15 years ago, they're going to look a lot different than what they do now. And that's partially because my subject matter has changed. I've experimented with technique over time and all kinds of different things like that. So these are all major aspects of creativity that we should take into account. Now, something else that we should talk about in relationship to artists in general is the idea of a trained versus an untrained artist. And that's not to say that one is inherently more valuable than the other. It's just that they come from different backgrounds, okay? So here we have two portraits. They're both painted at roughly the same time period in about the 1830s. However, on the right here we have a very early American portrait by Erastus Salisbury Field. And on the left, or I'm sorry, the right, we have a portrait by a very prominent French artist named Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, and of a much more prominent individual within society. So what we can see here are, once again, two portraits painted at about the same time, but there's a very dramatic difference in quality here. And there are reasons for that. So if we look at Salisbury Field's portrait over here, this is usually what's called naive, and this is someone who is probably almost entirely self-taught. So at this time in the 1830s, America is basically a rural backwater compared to Europe, And so most artists actually had to travel to Europe to learn from an established master. They would then come back to the United States and, kind of start their practice. However, this isn't always feasible for many people. So a lot of people early on in America in particular are much more provincial, and they have this kind of naive or folk art kind of look to their paintings. This is opposed to, say, Angra over here, very prominent artist, got commissions from the King of France, Napoleon, all kinds of people like this. He studied under Jacques-Louis David, who was court painter to King Louis XVI. He had his studio in the Louvre Palace before it became a museum. Very, very prominent individual. But he would have began his artistic training as a very young child, probably about 7 or 8 years old, versus Orestes Salisbury Field, who probably came to it much later in life, and once again was not taught by an established master, and as opposed, he's probably mostly self-taught. So there's a big difference, but that doesn't mean that we should devalue works like this over or under works like this. It's just that they're coming from different circumstances. Now, in general, most artists that we're going to look at do fall under the category of a trained artist. And so here we can see a painting that represents how Ingres would have gone about his artistic training. So this is Leon Mathieu Cocherou's The Studio of Jacques-Louis David. So this is where Ingres would have learned. What we see depicted here is a life drawing class. So this was the kind of typical hallmark for artistic training for many centuries. You would learn how to draw and paint from the nude human form because figurative subject matter was the kind of end-all be-all of the art world of the past, especially. So religious paintings, history paintings, things like that all had humans in them, and so this is a major thing. So artists would generally enter a studio like this as young children. You would begin by kind of being the servant to the master. You would clean his brushes, you would mix his palette, you would stretch the canvas, and you would do all these kind of minor things that would help you learn the process. And all the while you would begin to learn how to draw. And once you progress to a certain point and the master, kind of deemed you worthy enough to continue, you would then move up. So you would move from drawing to painting, and then eventually you would start working on the master's actual paintings themselves until you were declared a master yourself and you could strike out on your own, create your own studio, seek your own commissions, all of these kinds of things. But very, very typical way many artists learned how to become artists in the past. Now, opposed to trained artists, we also have untrained artists. And so Orestes Salisbury Field would fall under this untrained artist category. But under this category, there are two major kind of delineations that we can follow. The first would be a folk artist. And so a folk artist is an artist working in an established folk tradition. And so folk art usually serves some kind of utilitarian function and can consist of things like furniture, quilts, earthenware, so jugs, pots, plates, things like that, metalworking, even wooden decorative sculpture, etc., etc. So unlike fine art, which is usually purely aesthetic, so think of a painting just hanging on a wall to be admired, folk art usually has some kind of purpose for it as well. We can use it for something. And so just a few examples of some folk art here. Here we have an early, 19th century American cabinet. And so it serves the utilitarian function of, being used to store certain things. However, it takes on this folk art aspect because of this really nice decorative carving that we see on the front of the cabinet itself. However, we can also consider things like quilts to be a form of folk art because they come out of a folk tradition. Once again, they usually convey a wealth of different information, either generic patterns like we see in this sense, or sometimes storytelling elements. But they are usually created in the home, and they're also usually used to serve a specific utilitarian function. It keeps us warm while we're sleeping in winter and all kinds of things like that. But we also have some interesting aspects of folk art, and this is what's known as a sampler, and this was actually used and created as a form of education tool early on. This is largely something that would have been created by a school girl. So women, in education would make these, and they would not only be used as this kind of aesthetically pleasing object, but it would teach needlepoint. It would teach your ABCs, how to read, how to write, how to spell, all of these kinds of things. Many times they would also use or at least have basic mathematics in them. So it's a kind of interesting art form that was also used to help teach to some degree as well. So it serves a function in that regard. But we also have things like earthenware, so any form of pottery that has decorative elements placed on it can be considered a form of folk art as well. And so here we have a nice jug, which would serve a utilitarian function, but we have this kind of nice, naive or outsider drawing of a bird on the top there. But we also have things like metalwork. So here we have a weather vane. So it has the artistic flair of the rooster there, but it would serve the purpose of indicating from which direction the wind was blowing in an agricultural kind of setting, all of these kinds of things as well. But we do have other forms of folk art that are more traditional and perhaps take on more ritualistic kinds of purposes. So if we're familiar with the sugar skulls, such as we see here from Dia de los Muertos, or the Day of the Dead in Mexican heritage, this would also be considered a kind of folk art as well. This entire kind of aesthetic would also fall under that folk art umbrella as well. So I find that to be interesting. But aside from folk art, we also have naive or outsider artists. And these are artists that are working with personal expression apart from conventional practice, style, or awareness of art history or the trends of the art world of their time. Now, although naive artists lack formal training, they're not always a part of the art world of their day, but for the most part, they usually are. However, many outsider artists are not discovered until after their deaths due to their abstention from the art world. And so this is kind of an interesting phenomenon. We could probably consider Orestes Salisbury Field to be more of a naive or outsider artist versus a folk artist, even though they kind of bridge this gap in between, or he bridges a gap in between the two. We'll see another example of that here in a minute. But naive and outsider artists also tend to be influential on actual, artists within the art world as well, once they tend to be discovered later on, and we'll see an example of that as well. But arguably one of the most well-known naive or outsider artists is this man. This is Henry Darger, and this is one piece from his massive work of art known as In the Realms of the Unreal. And so this is actually a book that he wrote and hand illustrated, and the book is something like 71,000 pages long, and it comprises at least 3,000 to 5,000 different illustrations. And the story itself depicts or represents a kind of conflict between this group of children and a group of adults in this kind of mythical realm. And the children are fighting for their own autonomy and their own survival against these kind of malicious adults. And a lot of this has to do with Henry Darger's own upbringing. He was an orphan in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, endured a lot of abuse in that kind of situation. And so the rest of his life, he donated a lot of money to help orphans and children in need and a lot of things like that. But it's important to note that he worked as a janitor his whole life, and his artwork wasn't discovered until after he died and his apartment was entered, and they just found this massive amount of material just there that no one had ever known about. And so it's kind of interesting in that regard. But if we see here we can see one of the more tame examples from this collection. The story is actually quite violent, and so a lot of the a lot of the imagery deals with violence and things like that. So I don't show a lot, but if you're interested in looking at it, you can go look it up online. But he's making most of this artwork out of cut paper collage, as well as watercolor and transfer paper tracings that he's doing out of children's books, comics from the newspaper, as well as book illustrations and all kinds of things like that. So these are actually multimedia collages, or that's at least what they're considered to be. But once again, they incorporate a lot of different material from a wide variety of different sources. But if we look at just another example from it, here we can see one of the more violent passages. So we have this kind of group of children that are fighting against this kind of group of adults and everything like that. So it's rather interesting. These are two of the more tame examples. Some of them are really wild and out there. Once again, if you want to look those up on your own, feel free. But some of them are kind of disturbing. But he is one of the more well-known outsider naive artists. Now, opposed to Henry Darger, one of the other more famous examples of a naive or outsider artist is this individual. This is Henry Rousseau. And prominent French artists around the late 19th, early 20th centuries. He actually is very influential on a lot of the early modernist artwork within the beginnings of the 20th century. So very influential there, despite being completely devoid of the art world of his day. What I find interesting about Henry Rousseau is that he actually doesn't pick up a paintbrush until he's 44 years old. And the first part of his life, he worked as like a post official or postman, and he just decided that he hated it and decided he wanted to paint one day. And so he just picked up a paintbrush and went to it. So his artwork has this very kind of childlike, naive quality to it. But once again, many of the early modernist artists of the 20th century who are trying to reject traditional tropes of academic standards dating all the way back to the Renaissance really look to his work for inspiration in recapturing that kind of childlike spontaneity within a work of art. So he's very influential in that regard. But he's really well known for doing these very kind of interesting scenes that represent nature, as well as kind of allegorical figures and scenes as well. A lot of them kind of harken to this idea of the kind of earthly paradise, the Garden of Eden, all kinds of things like this. So he also deals a lot with exoticism, which is very popular during his day. So he's looking to exotic subject matter from Africa and the Middle East and things like that. So always kind of an interesting deal. But once again, his artwork has this rather flat, almost childlike quality to it, and this is owing to the fact that he is a completely self-taught painter. He never took a lesson in his life. He just kind of started painting just for the sheer pleasure of it. Now, aside from Henry Rousseau, one of the other more famous naive or outsider artists is this individual. This is Edward Hicks. And I find him interesting because he does bridge the gap with folk art. He actually begins his career as a folk artist, as a sign painter in early America, pre-United States America, and then bridges into the early 19th century. So this painting, coming from the 1830s, very much like Aristus Salisbury Field, has this kind of quasi-folk art kind of look to it. But Edward Hicks is also beginning to bridge into the realm of allegory with this. So here we have one of a series of works that he did, all based on the same subject and what he calls the peaceable kingdom. And this is meant to represent certain ideas about early America at this time. So early on, America was founded by, Puritans and people seeking religious freedom. And many of them look at, especially in this kind of Puritan evangelical Christian kind of mindset are looking at the New World or America as this kind of earthly paradise, this untamed wilderness, if you will. And so this painting is meant to hearken to certain biblical ideas like that. So it's meant to hearken to this idea of the Garden of Eden. We can also see with the menagerie of animals here, he's hearkening to this idea of Noah's Ark and things like that. But we can also see this homage to Native Americans and early colonial, Europeans coming and making a treaty here in the background for this peaceable kingdom to kind of exist. And so it's making certain homages to American identity at this time in the early 19th century and everything like that. But what I find interesting about it is if we look at some of the animals, especially the lion here in the center, it's pretty obvious that Edward Hicks probably never saw a lion in his life. It looks fairly strange. But once again, this is coming out of this outsider, naive artist mentality. He's probably almost completely self-taught. And once again, he's, using or at least creating subjects based on hearsay or, visual or verbal information that he's heard from time to time without actually seeing these things. So it's kind of weird. Folk art, naive art usually tends to be a little on the weirder side, but it also has a kind of charming quality to it, in my opinion, as well. Now, aside from naive or outsider artists or folk art, there are other kinds of art that we can talk about. And so one of the most prominent forms of art that exists is what's known as representational art. And that is an artwork that depicts the appearance of things often as they appear in nature. And so this is the predominant art form throughout most of history. Even if we're dealing with something that's somewhat abstract, it might still be representational of a subject. And we'll get into that here a little bit as well. But here we can see a nice, what's known as a Vanitas still life by Peter Cleats. Very, very prominent form of representation in the 1600s or the 17th century. And what I find interesting about these Vanitas still lifes is that it's not just the objects that we see on the surface. This is actually meant to have an allegorical meaning underneath it. So Vanitas is Latin and it refers to the vanity of life. And so many of these Vanitas still lifes will have attributes of life, that the kind of pleasurable attributes or the fleeting attributes. So things like good food or money or literature or, knowledge, things like that. So we can see that referenced here by, say, the book and the quill, this idea of knowledge and things like that. We can also see this like wine goblet here. But many of them also present what's known as a memento mori, or a reminder of death's imminence. And so we can see that here with the skull. And the idea of this is to act as a moral treatise, to say, enjoy life, enjoy its pleasures, but don't enjoy it too much, because one day we'll have to be judged for our deeds in life and all of that kind of thing. So they have a kind of moral message behind them. So just because something is representational of an object doesn't necessarily mean that it's not also trying to impart some kind of subjective meaning on us as well. Now, once again, representational artwork is very common. Here we have a nice example. I'm sure we've probably seen this before, but here we see Gilbert Stuart's portrait of George Washington, which hangs in the White House. So once again, it's a representational work because it represents how George Washington would have looked at the time. And so we know who it is. It looks like a person. It's representational of that, etc., etc. However, we also have figurative art, and figurative art is usually representational in and of itself, but this is artwork that's primarily representing the human figure or the human form. So unlike Peter Cleats's, still life, which we just saw, which is a purely representational painting, it's not necessarily figurative because it doesn't necessarily show human presence. Now that's a subjective argument as well, but unlike Anthony Van Dyck's Samson and Delilah here, the main focus of this painting is the human form. And so, if we're unfamiliar, here we have a biblical story. So Samson is this kind of great king of the Israelites, and he has this tremendous godlike power that is based on his hair, his long hair. And so many people don't like him, and they try to supplant him. And so this individual here, Delilah, seduces Samson, and in his sleep she cuts his hair off, which devoids him of his kind of godlike power, and he is then taken away by this host of soldiers. And so we see in true fashion, this very kind of climactic scene or moment within the scene. So we can see the kind of, anguish on Samson's face there, the tumult in his body, the kind of tension in his body there, and everything like that. So once again, though, the human figure is the primary focus of this work of art. And so figurative art, once again, like representational art, is a type of artwork that we'll see a lot of, especially throughout history. But here we have just another example of figurative art. This is an allegorical scene from the Augustan Aurapraxis, or Altar of Peace. So this is an altar devoted to the Roman Emperor Augustus. This would have been used to make offerings to the imperial cult. Under Roman law, it was, required that all citizens make, sacrifices or offerings to the cult of the emperor in a religious kind of fashion. But here we can see an allegorical scene which is meant to hearken to Augustus's divine origin and everything like that, which would supplant or surmount his divine right of rule and all of these kinds of things, these ideas. But aside from figurative art, we also have an art form that's known as trompe-l'oeil, and this literally means to fool the eye in French. And it's a hyperreal or illusionistic representation of a subject. And so here we can see a nice example of a trompe-l'oeil by Piero Borello del Caso, and this is Escaping Criticism. And so we have a young boy painted as if he's coming out of the frame of his own painting. Now, it's important to note that the frame we see here is actually not a real frame. It's actually a part of the painting itself. And so many times these trompe-l'oeil works would have elements that would help to incorporate the work into its envisioned space of viewing. So it would blend into the kind of wall that it was hanging on or something like that to help increase the overall illusionistic effect of the work of art. So in that regard, most trompe-l'oeil is actually done in conjecture or in connection with architecture. I apologize for that real fast. But here we can see how it's usually carried out in architecture. And so this is Giovanni Battista Goioli's The Triumph of the Name of Jesus on the vault of the church at Geso in Rome. And so this is encompassing the entire ceiling of the sanctuary of this particular church. And what we see depicted here is actually a Last Judgment scene. So we can see the faithful being taken up into the warm, embrace of the light of God here in the center, and then the damned being cast into the shadow of hell down here on the left, and everything like that. Now, it's important to note that this photograph doesn't really do this justice. If we were there in person, you would see the effect much more wholeheartedly, and that effect is enhanced by the addition of actual 3D elements. And so if we look, in these little naves all along the edge here, we actually have physical sculptures placed in these kind of niches in the wall. Now, these sculptures are then echoed by painted sculptures in the form of these little angels all over here, but these angels also have plaster aspects to them that protrude off, so parts of their faces and their hands actually come off of the wall into the third dimension. And so it creates this overall 3D-like effect within the work of art if we're standing there. And it's enhanced once again by this idea of the clouds spilling out of the central panel here, as well as the figures kind of sprawling out of that as well. So it creates, if we were standing there, this kind of illusion that if we were looking up, we would be looking up and out as the heavens kind of poured out into this, kind of sanctuary space, if you will. So it's a very interesting kind of aspect. If you ever get a chance to go to Europe and go into some of these, old churches and things, you'll see this quite a bit. They do this quite often. But we can also play with the nature of perception, not only in how we, view an illusion of reality within a work of art, but we can also play up our perceptions of what reality is within a work of art. So here we can see this is Rene Magritte's Ce n'est pas, or The Treachery of Image. And so if we see here in French, he has written Ce n'est pas une pipe, which means this is not a pipe. And you might ask yourself, well, why isn't this a pipe? It looks like a pipe. However, it's not an actual pipe. Let's say, for instance, that my coaster here was an actual pipe. I'm holding it, I can use it, I can interact with it. It is the actual object. However, if I was to take a photograph of it, it would still be the actual pipe. However, it's a mechanical representation of that object. I can no longer use it for its intended purpose. I can still recognize that it is the actual pipe. However, it no longer has a use because it is a photograph. In that sense, the photograph would be one step removed away from reality. Now, if I was then to go and make a painting based on that photograph, it then is no longer an actual representation of the actual object. It is my own interpretation of a representation of an actual object. And therefore, like Rene Magritte's pipe here, it's two steps removed away from reality. So we can use artwork to play up philosophical games within the realm of aesthetics and things like that. So this is a little bit on the nose example, but Rene Magritte, very prominent Dada artist as well as surrealist much later on in his career and everything like that. So we can play with not only the nature of how we perceive reality, but the nature of how we perceive different elements of reality within a work of art as well. Now, aside from that, we also have abstract art, or art that abstracts. And this would be to take form and extract the essence of an object or an idea within the work of art. So, art that has no reference at all, or that simplifies, distorts, or exaggerates representational objects or nature can be considered abstract art. So abstraction is often utilized to emphasize, exaggerate, or reveal certain qualities within a given work. So many times, many abstract artists are playing up more the idea of how do we perceive emotions or something like that, rather than actual physical representationalism. So here we can see a nice example of this. So here we have Pablo Picasso's The Weeping Woman. Now, obviously, this is very abstract. It does not look like a person would in nature. However, it's still representational. We can still take a recognizable subject away from it. So this is an interesting aspect of abstract work. It can be used to emphasize things that don't naturally exist, or it can be used to exaggerate representational subjects. So in this sense, Picasso is using abstraction to play up the idea of grief and of sorrow within the emotional quality of this figure. So it creates a kind of tempestuousness, or this kind of tension within the image itself. So that's one way that we can use abstraction in correlation with representational subject matter to overplay or upplay certain kind of qualities within how we as the viewer experience the work of art. Likewise, though, we can have abstract works of art that are very representational, such as Salvador Dali's Apparition of the Face and the Fruit Dish on a Beach here. And so we can see, obviously, this is a scene that does not exist in nature. It is a purely abstract invention, but we can perhaps pick out certain recognizable objects within it. And so that's one of the ways, once again, how abstract and representational work can kind of blend together. Now, that is opposed to say non-representational art. And this is, or sometimes referred to as non-objective art. And this is a visual form with no specific reference to anything outside of themselves. So, non representational art is purely aesthetic. It's not trying to represent the illusion of something or an image of something or anything like that. Instead, it becomes much more about trying to represent emotion or abstract qualities, or let the actual physicality of the artistic materials be the main subject matter and things like this. So non-representational paintings are usually what we tend to think of when we think of abstract art, but it's a major aspect of non-representational art. However, we could also think of things like quilts and woven patterns, so tapestry or clothing as being a non-representational art form as well. Islamic art, in particularly, is almost purely non-representational in the form of geometric patterning and things like that. And we'll talk more about Islamic art later on as well. But it's almost purely non-representational. But we could also consider music to be non-representational art form, in that it is the most purely non-representational or most purely abstract art form that exists. And we're in this sense we're talking about pure music, not the lyrics that impart meaning on us. But think about like classical music that has a much more emotional kind of quality to it. And so many non-representational artists will also look to things like music for inspiration. Guys like Jackson Pollock, who we'll see a little bit later on as well. Well, such as we see here. So here we can see a non-representational work by Jackson Pollock, and we might be quick to dismiss work like this as being, inherently childlike or something like that. But it's important to note that it's coming from a distinct place, a distinct time, and it's also referencing distinct things. So Jackson Pollock, for instance, is very influenced by the abstract rhythm of jazz music and things like that. So he's known to have kind of, danced around the canvas while it was on the floor while he's kind of flinging this paint around. And even though it might seem wild, some of it is very kind of chaotically thrown around, but other aspects of it is very tightly controlled and things like that. So it's not necessarily as simple as it might look at first glance. Now, we can also have non-objective or non-representational abstraction that is still taking on kind of much more interesting or realistic like field. Now, this isn't to say that any of this is realistic. So here we see painting by Yves Tanguay, an abstract surrealist artist, but he's dealing with, complete abstract invention. He has completely made this off the top of his head. This does not exist in nature in any form. So it is purely abstract, but it is starting to represent an idea of space or object within this context as well. So just because something is purely non-representational doesn't mean that it's not still echoing form or content or other things like that. Now, aside from our different forms of art, we also have to talk about looking and seeing. And so these might seem similar, but they're in fact very different. So looking refers to a habitual kind of practice and implies taking in what is before us in a general mechanical or goal-oriented manner. Whereas seeing is a more open, receptive, and focused version of looking, where we look for memories, imagination, or attached feelings, while also remembering similar experiences. So, looking, in our purposes, we can consider the actual physical act of seeing, and we're looking at something, our brain registers it, and all of this. But to truly see something, we have to look at it for a while, and we have to look for implied meanings. We have to look for symbolism, for motifs, for different things like that, and then bring those to our own interpretation of what we're seeing. So, seeing is the more in-depth version of looking, if you will. Now, aside from looking and seeing, we also have to distinguish between form and content. And so these two things usually go hand in hand, but they are very different. So form refers to the total effect of the combined visual qualities within a work, including its material, its color, its shape, its line, and all of its design aspects. Whereas content refers to the message or meaning of the work of art. And so content determines form, and form expresses content, thus making the two inseparable. So, once again, this deals a lot with how the artist wants their content to be perceived. So, a monumental sculpture that's 50 feet tall is going to be read much differently than, say, a miniature painting or portrait painting that's only yay big. So once again, the form, the actual material it's made of is going to dictate how a viewer reads the content and vice versa. So very important. But a nice example of that would be here. So here we can see Auguste Rodin's The Kiss. And so we have a very prominent sculptor and a sculptural form, but what we see represented here is form and content in one specific way. So the form is marble. So we have a marble sculpture, but Auguste Rodin is using the marble in different ways to accentuate certain qualities within the work of art. So if we're looking at this, we have The Kiss. And so we can see Auguste Rodin is using marble to echo this kind of masculine and feminine quality within the sculptural form. So we can see, the actual physical difference between the male figure in the background and the female figure up front. So the male figure is a little bit more muscular, whereas the female figure has a little bit more of a soft, rounded form. But this is also echoed by the base of the stone and the figures themselves. So the figures have been very highly polished to an almost mirror-like sheen, whereas the base that they're sitting on has remained very roughly hewn. So this is meant to echo the idea of the kind of physical difference between the masculine and the feminine. However, we also have this very tender moment. So we have this very tender embrace between these two lovers as they share a passionate kiss and everything like that. Now, if we look, however, at this example, the exact same subject matter, The Kiss by Constantine Brancusi, we see a very different form. So we see, once again, we have a stone form with the same content. However, the form is in a much different kind of fashion than Auguste Rodin. So we see a much more simplified version of this, even though it's the same subject and the same basic concept. It's presented in a much more abstracted kind of way, much more simple kind of way. And so in this sense, Constantine Brancusi has given us the idea of a kiss, whereas Auguste Rodin has given us the feeling of a kiss. And so once again, this is very subjective because how we feel about a passionate moment such as this might differ wildly based on our own personal experience. This is still usually the kind of generic connotation that we might come to with the idea of, love and passion and things like that. Whereas, Brancusi has given us much more the idea of the embrace over the passion of the embrace, if you will. So once again, we have the same subject matter and basically the same form in both of these two sculptures, but they're, kind of enacted in wildly, dramatically different ways. So form and content can, really be used to echo certain ideas or play up certain ambiguities or juxtapositions such as we've seen. Now, seeing and responding to form, the viewer must receive and experience the work for communication to be complete. So it's not just that the artist presents us with something, but we, the viewers, actually have to look at and experience that work of art and, take it into our own minds and, kind of try to deal with what the artist is trying to put out for us. So we actually have to kind of look through the symbolism that's used and look at all of the different aspects of it to create an informed opinion about it. but our actions are guided by the reading of forms and people, things, and events, such as things like body language and personal feeling. So we're actually doing this on a daily basis, almost all the time. And once again, this becomes somewhat subjective because our experiences are going to, vary dramatically depending on who we are. But subject matter can be, or can interfere with our perception of form by promoting certain narratives. And so we often only see things freshly when confronted with the unfamiliar. And so sometimes, once again, we have to put aside our own prejudices or our own preconceived notions to really look at something freshly for the first time. And so this is an interesting subjective quality of artwork, and that is, depending on where we're coming from or what we're looking at, that we might have to, kind of reimagine our own perceptions of certain things or reality or information to interact with these works of art in a more effective kind of manner. Now, here we can see a nice example of this. This is a painting that's very abstract, and if I didn't tell you who it was by or what it was of, we could perhaps take a wide variety of different interpretations away from it. So, especially if we were to say, move the painting in a different orientation, if we were to flip it over on its side or upright it or whatnot, it could read in very dramatically different ways. Now, this is a painting by Georgia O'Keeffe, and it is of a flower, but if we didn't know that information, we could still take this as being a purely abstract, non-representational kind of form, because it would then become more about the interplay of line, shape, color, and things like that, as opposed to recognizable subjects. But aside from that, something else we can talk about is iconography. And this really plays into how we perceive information and how we interpret it. So iconography refers to the subjects, symbols, and motifs used in an image to convey meaning in a work of art. And so iconography is very ubiquitous. It spans all cultures and all time periods, but it's going to change dramatically depending on what time period and what culture we're talking about. So, not all artwork contains iconography, but iconography is often conveyed through things like symbolism, which carry deeper levels of meaning than the obvious, especially in terms of cultural practice. So, the iconography of, Christian medieval Europe is going to be much different than, say, medieval Buddhist China, and vice versa, etc., etc., etc. But iconography can convey a wealth of cultural information. So every culture is going to have its own unique forms of iconography, and they're going to dramatically, kind of change. And some of them, actually kind of share many different iconographical forms. But iconography is established by convention and traditions of various cultural heritages. So once again, it's going to be very much tied to where in the world and what time period we're referring to. But just a few examples of iconography to end us off for this particular lecture. So here we can see two paintings, also painted roughly contemporary to one another in and about the early 1500s, and by two prominent Renaissance masters. On the left here we have Leonardo da Vinci's St. John the Baptist, and on the right we have Raphael's Madonna del Foligno. And if we notice here, we actually have St. John the Baptist represented in both of these paintings. And without the information on the painting for us to reference, we might ask ourselves, well, how would we know what the subject is? Well, this is where iconography comes into play. Because throughout the Renaissance and medieval period and even into the early modern period, it was very common to represent John the Baptist in a very specific kind of way. And most oftentimes, he's depicted pointing upwards like this. So if you're ever looking at a Christian painting and you see a figure who's pointing up like that, most likely that is John the Baptist. Now, he's also usually depicted as a kind of wild man. And it's hard to see in Da Vinci's painting here because of its darkness, but he's actually depicted wearing a fur robe, just like he is over here in Raphael's painting. So this would be another way that we could pick out who John the Baptist was in these in these religious paintings. Now, Da Vinci's painting is fairly straightforward and simple, but if we look at Raphael's, we can also see a number of other Christian iconographic symbols that are very common in the Renaissance medieval period. And so if we look, we can see the main subject here is the Madonna and Child, or the Virgin Mary and the infant Jesus. Now we know that that is, who these characters are meant to represent because, first and foremost, the Virgin Mary is almost always going to be depicted in red and blue robes. That's how we know who the Virgin Mary is in these religious paintings. So she is almost always going to be depicted in clothing like this. Now, we can also tell that she is the Virgin Mary because she's sitting enthroned on a cloud in the firmament. And this idea of the firmament is echoed by a few different symbolic motifs here. So first and foremost, we can see her left foot is propped up. This is a symbolic, kind of motif for kingship or lordship, dating back to ancient times. But we can see that her foot is propped up on this kind of rainbow or this orb, which is meant to echo the idea of the firmament or the kind of dome of heaven. And this is the medieval concept of the universe, if you will. And this idea of the firmament is also echoed in the actual top of the painting here, which is echoed by this, kind of semicircular dome. And we can also see that referenced by this kind of sun halo that encompasses the Virgin and Child there. And so these are all meant to be echoes of the Virgin Mary and the infant Jesus's lordship over the universe, if you will, within this context. Now we can also see that the orb here is made up of angels that are represented in the clouds, or what's known as putti, or these kind of cherub angels. And these are meant to be symbolically referencing the idea of the divine or God, in general. So oftentimes you'll see God represented not literally, but rather symbolically by these kinds of clouds of angels or radiating light emanating from these clouds and things like that as well. Now, aside from that, we can also see some other symbolic motifs. For instance, we can see the figure of Joseph over here, who's almost always depicted in blue and white. In fact, all of the biblical characters generally have a kind of color coordination so that we would know who each individual figure was. Things like that. So just a few basic symbols that are very common throughout a number of Christian artworks in general. However, if we were to look at Buddhist artwork, this particular representation of Siddhartha, or the Buddha himself, we can see a number of Buddhist symbolic motifs, and we'll be dealing with these a little bit later on as well when we talk about Asian artwork. But generally speaking, moving from top to bottom here, the Buddha is usually represented with a halo, which is meant to echo the idea of his own spiritual enlightenment. But we can also see that his head or his hair is usually done in this kind of top knot hairstyle, which is meant to echo the idea of the lotus blossom, which you'll also usually see in conjunction with the Buddha, such as we see down here at the bottom. And this is also a symbol of enlightenment. So the lotus flower and this top knot hairstyle are symbols of enlightenment. We can also see that Siddhartha, or the Buddha, is usually also depicted with these very elongated earlobes, and this is meant to be a reference to his earthly life as a prince. So he's actually born into royalty, and he decides to give up his wealth to kind of go about this journey of spiritual enlightenment and everything like that. So this is meant to be symbolic of his, heavy gold earrings that he wore as a prince, and then he gets rid of them, and so it's meant to be symbolic of his giving up of his wealth. Now, likewise, he's usually also depicted in a very simple garment, such as we see here. Very simple robe, and this is meant to be symbolic of his journey in becoming an ascetic hermit. And so an ascetic is somebody who gives up all earthly kind of trappings, not only their wealth, but they even forego food and all kinds of things like that in order to attain enlightenment. So this is meant to be symbolic of that. But we can also see that the Buddha is usually depicted in a stance of meditation, which is also meant to reference this idea of the lotus blossom. But he's usually also holding his hands in a gesture of prayer and of blessing as well. So this is a very common gesture that you'll see the Buddha or Buddhist figures making. And this is also, once again, a symbol of meditation, of prayer, and of enlightenment. So very, very common traits within Buddhist art, iconography and everything like this. And just to end us, another example here would be, Islamic art. And Islamic art has a much different form of iconography in that most Islamic art does not represent representational subject matter in a religious context. And we'll get into reasons why that is when we talk about Islamic art, but a lot of Islamic art is mostly based on geometry as well as calligraphy. So geometry and calligraphy are the main iconographical kind of hallmarks within Islamic art. And so here we can see this is the interior of the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. So this is a mosque that is over the place where Muhammad is said to have, done something. I believe he ascended into heaven from this site and everything like that. But we can see this very grandiose use of geometric patterning all throughout. We can also see Arabic Kufic calligraphy taken straight from the Quran being used to enhance our religious devotion in this context and everything like that. So very, very common iconographical traits within Islamic art as well. And just to end us off really quickly, a little bit of iconography from Hindu art. Hindu art is very interesting, in my opinion, in that it tends to represent very multifaceted kinds of forms. So what we see here is a modern kind of rendering of a scene from the Bhagavad Gita. This is one of the major Hindu Vedas, or kind of religious texts or mythological texts. And in the scene, we see the Prince Arjuna, who is being, he's being talked to by, Krishna here, who is trying to persuade Arjuna to do his princely duty in battle. And so to do this, Krishna reveals his radiant form, his godly form. And so many times in Hindu mythology, when a deity takes on their radiant form, they describe it as being like the light of 1,000 suns, and they take on, all of their different attributes at once. And so usually the deity is then represented in these kind of multifaceted ways. So you usually see multiple arms and multiple faces and all kinds of things like this. But these are all meant to represent the individual aspects of the deity Krishna himself. And so all of the different kinds of aspects that he is responsible for, that he takes on, that he deals with in his own divine way, and everything like this. So I've always found that to be kind of interesting way of representing a form and everything like that. I also find it interesting that there's a lot of crossover between Buddhist and Hindu iconography, and especially in certain parts of Asia, and we'll see that a little bit later on as well. So that ends us for today, and then we'll pick up next time with our next lecture. So until then, I'll see you later.